Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have Martin Van Buren Bates. Last time we spoke about Anna Haining Bates, and today we are talking about her husband, Martin. These two were an insanely tall couple. In fact, Martin was known as the Kentucky Giant. Records show that his height really jumped up around the age of 6 or 7, and by the time he was 12 years old, he stood over 6 feet tall and weighed over 200 pounds. In the end, he certainly was not done growing, as he grew to be 7'9" and he weighed 475 pounds. After Anna passed away in 1888, Martin did remarry, and his life is said to have been relatively peaceful until his passing in 1919. He passed away from nephritis. After his passing, he was buried beside Anna and their son. Martin is said to still hold the title of tallest person to ever live until at least 80 years old, which honestly is quite remarkable.
Number 9. Giant skeleton. In 1890 in France, a man named Georges Vacher made a skeletal discovery in a Bronze Age cemetery in Castelnau. 3 separate bone fragments were found that came from both the arm and the leg, or humerus and tibia bones for all the scientists out there. The bones seem to date back to the Neolithic era, which was around 10,000 to 4000 BC, and they are thought to be evidence of one of the largest human beings ever. The man who discovered them used the size of the bone fragments to estimate the total size of the person, which would have been around 11.5 feet tall. In 1892, the bones were sent to a university in France to be carefully studied by a professor of pathological anatomy, him admitting that the bones represented a quote, very tall race. A few years later, giant skulls were found in another French cemetery and also sent away for even more study.
In our number 8 spot today, we have the Ancient Giant. Back in 1991, researchers were excavating a necropolis in Fidene, which in ancient times would have been a territory that was indirectly managed by Rome. During this excavation, experts came across a tomb that was abnormally long, and after examination they too learned that the bones were also unusual. This discovery would later go on to become the first complete ancient skeleton of a person with gigantism. Measured to be 6'8", this person would have been a giant in the 3rd century AD in Rome, where the average man stood about 5.5 feet tall. The team was able to confirm this gigantism diagnosis when they found the skull, although they were pretty certain beforehand due to the size difference seen in this set of bones compared to the average bones for the time period. Although this discovery is an incredible one, we still know very little about what life would have been like for a giant in ancient Rome. In our number 7 spot today, we have Sandy Allen. For this one, firstly, I have to shout out a most amazing top 10 viewer who goes by the YouTube screen name Angelisa Cephas, because they commented on part 1 of this video and gave me the info I needed to include Sandy Allen on this list today. Yeah, I'm lurking in the comments. Get nervous about it, never know what I'm gonna see there. Thank you, Angelisa. Now let's talk about Sandy Allen. Sandy lived in Shelbyville, Indiana, and her life spanned from 1955 until 2008. During her life, she was recognized by the Guinness World Records as the tallest woman in the world. She was recorded as being 7 feet 7 inches tall, and her height was a result of the fact that she had a tumor on her pituitary gland that caused it to release growth hormone uncontrollably, like somewhere between 200 to 1,000 times more than usual. In 1977, when she was 22 years old, she underwent surgery for her condition, because if she hadn't, she would have just continued to grow. Throughout her life, Sandy appeared on TV, in documentaries, and even had a song written about her. Later in life, unfortunately, Sandy found herself having to use a wheelchair because her legs and back were unable to support her tall stature. While she passed away in 2008, in 2020, her friend and manager John Kleeman donated a collection of her memorabilia to Ripley's Museums. In our number 6 spot today, we have Väinö Myllynen. Väinö was born in Helsinki, Finland in 1909, and he lived up until 1963. Because of some issues he had with his pituitary gland, he stood 7'4" when he was just 21 years old, but this was not the end of his growth spurt. Oh no, he experienced another in his late 30s, which is when he grew to be 8'4". During his life, he not only traveled Europe as a wrestler, but he also served time in the Finnish army. This is where he began to be considered the tallest soldier forever. After his time wrestling and serving the country, in 1946 he moved to where he could run a chicken farm, which is where he spent the rest of his life. Just a year before his death, as he was being measured at the doctor, his hand span was measured to be 290 millimeters or 11.4 inches, which is thought to be one of the largest known. In our number 5 spot today, we've got Don KOEHLER. Don is a man who was born in the United States in 1925, and he lived until 1981. Don is another one of the few people who can be added to the list of humans who were able to reach over 8 feet tall, as it is recorded that Don grew to be 8'2". Don and his twin sister were born to parents who were slightly above average height. His mother was 5'10" and his father was 6'2", but Don was the only one in the family at the time who reached these record-holding heights. Don's twin sister grew to be 5'9", which means that there was a distance of 2 feet and 5 inches between the two, which is a record recognized by Guinness. Don explained that the most difficult piece of clothing to find to fit his size was socks, and thankfully later in his life a hosiery company in Pennsylvania started custom making him socks. Later in his life, Don would unfortunately suffer from kyphosis, which resulted in some severe curvature of the spine. At 55 years old, Don passed from a heart condition, and, as per his wishes, he was cremated and then his ashes spread on Lake Wisconsin, where he loved to fish. In our number 4 spot today, we have Suleiman Ali Nashnush. Suleiman was a Libyan basketball player who turned actor, and in fact he is one of the tallest basketball players ever. He grew to be just shy of 8'1", although during his basketball career he was measured at 7'10". He was born in 1943, and in 1960 he successfully went through surgery that helped to slow down his growth. Throughout his life, he was able to play a small role in the Federico Fellini film Fellini Satyricon, where he played an attendant. Suleiman passed away in 1991. In our number 3 spot today, we have John Rogan. Not to be confused with the podcaster and comedian Joe Rogan, John is the second tallest man known in history. Born in 1867, John grew to be 8'9.5 inches, which is second to only Robert Wadlow, who we talked about on part 1. John was born in Tennessee and was the 4th of 12 children. He grew extremely rapidly, which unfortunately led to ankylosis, which caused abnormal rigidity of the skeletal joints. By 1882, this sadly left John unable to stand or walk. John was still able to make a living despite this mobility issue, and to do this he sold portraits and postcards at the train station. Many offers came his way to perform in the circus and in sideshows, but John declined them all. It is said that John used a goat pull cart as a wheelchair, and that everywhere he went he was the center of attention, not only for his height but because he had just a big and lovely personality. There is a record stating that John's maternal grandfather was also a giant, requiring a larger saddle when riding a horse, so it is thought that perhaps there might have been some genetics at play here. John lived until 1905. In that year he passed away on September 12th. In our number 2 spot today, we have the Giant of CASTELNAU. A little different from most of the other people on this list, the Giant of CASTELNAU is the term used to refer to 3 bone fragments, a humerus, tibia, and femoral midshaft, that were discovered by a French anthropologist in 1890. He found these bones in the sediment used to cover a Bronze Age burial tumulus that some think might even date back to the Neolithic. If his measurements and estimates are correct, whoever these bones belong to would have been the largest human to be known to have existed. This is because, based on the bone size, he has estimated that this person would have been 11'6". Of course, without the rest of the bones, this is hard to confirm for sure, and it's important to note that there hasn't been a modern review done on these bones just yet. Perhaps it's something worth pursuing, however, especially if it means we could confirm the existence of a human who was 11.5 feet tall. In our number 1 spot today, we have Andrei Rene Roussimoff. When we think about real-life giants, of course, many of our minds go to none other than Andre the Giant. Born in France in 1946, Andre later went on to become a successful wrestler and professional actor. His gigantism caused him to grow to be 7'4", and this left him often being referred to as the 8th wonder of the world. After finding quite a bit of success in his wrestling career, Andre began finding himself starring in many movies, including the 1984 classic Conan the Destroyer, where he starred opposite Arnold Schwarzenegger, or his most recognizable role of Fezzik the Giant in the 1987 film The Princess Bride. Andre met quite a sudden and unexpected death at the age of 46 after suffering from congested heart failure. After his death, the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame described him as, quote, one of the most recognizable figures in the world, both as a professional wrestler and as a pop culture icon. In our number 10 spot today, we have Fyodor Makhnov. Fyodor was born in June of 1878 1948 in what would now be modern-day Belarus. As a child, he began to grow quite quickly, measuring 6'7" when he was just 14 years old. He of course needed custom-made clothes and even a custom-made bed, and it is said that his boots were so big that other children could hide in them while playing hide and seek. Because of the times he lived in as well as his exceptional height, at just 16 years old he began to perform in the circus, where it is said he grew to be 8'2". Someone of this size is going to have quite the appetite. You need a lot of fuel to keep that body going, and it is said that in an average daily breakfast he would eat 20 eggs, 8 loaves of bread, and would drink 2 liters of tea. And that's just for breakfast. Scientists would often approach him to ask if he would sign a contract for ownership of his body after he passed, but he always refused because he was afraid that if he signed the contract, he would be killed. Sadly, he would pass away at quite an early age. In 1912, he passed at just 34 years old. He left behind his wife, who was tall for a woman, but at the time still stood 3 feet and 3 inches shorter than him, as well as 4 children. In our number 9 spot today, we have Julius Cook. Julius lived from 1872 until March of 1902, and during his life he was often referred to as Constantine the Giant. Julius is one of the tallest people ever. At the age of 14 years old, he already measured 6'4". During his life, his height was advertised as being 8'6", but many people speculate that this was a bit of an exaggeration, as his skeleton measured 8'1", although no one is quite certain exactly what his height was, which we will get to in a second. Although maybe not the tallest man ever, Julius did set his own record, as he had the longest femurs ever measured at 76 centimeters or 30 inches. Julius's height is attributed to gigantism with an enlarged pituitary gland, and unfortunately, Julius had quite a bit of trouble walking. Like I mentioned before, Julius's height hasn't been confirmed and has only ever been estimated because of the fact that after a series of bad falls, his legs were really badly injured. This left gangrene setting in, after which his legs had to be amputated. This is why unfortunately his exact height is difficult to know for sure. Julius's skeleton is preserved at the Museum of Natural History in Mons, Belgium. In our number 8 spot today, we have Zhan Shichai. Zhan was born in China in the 1840s, but he would later move to England and tour around, known as Chang Wu Gao. Before his move, however, he grew to be 7 feet 9 inches tall, and he was actually appointed as a member of the Emperor's court. His move to England was initially supposed to be just a short trip, but he would go on to stay for 2 years because thousands of people paid 3 shillings just to see him and his tall stature. He went on to tour throughout the rest of Europe as well, and sometimes during his show he would be displayed beside a little person in order to really dramatize just how tall he was, and in 1881 he went on to join P.T. Barnum's circus. Zhan passed away in 1893, and based on his wishes, although he was loved and had intrigued the attention of thousands, his funeral was only attended by 50 of his friends. It is said that since he was so tall, his coffin measured 8.5 feet long. In our number 7 spot today, we have Adam Rayner. So many of the people on this list started out growing quite tall at young ages, but that couldn't be further from the truth for Adam. In fact, Adam was actually below average height for the beginning of his life, so much so that he was being turned down from the army during World War I because he wasn't tall enough. Adam was born in Austria in 1899, and at his first attempt to join the army, he was only 4'6". He tried to join again the following year but was rejected, and at 19 years old, he measured only 4'8". Just a couple of years later, however, at age 21, things would drastically change and he would soon reach a height of 7'1". This fast-paced and late growth spurt caused him some troubles though, because as he grew, his spinal cord curved. Eventually, Adam went on to get surgery to try and stop his pituitary gland from creating more growth hormones, but this did not stop it entirely and merely just slowed the pace at which he grew. His health would continue to decline because of his condition, and it left him blind in one eye, deaf in one ear, and eventually his curved spine left him unable to get out of bed. Adam passed away at the age of 51 years old after reaching a height of 7'8". In our number 6 spot today, we have Agnes Macaskill. Agnes was born in Scotland in 1825, and it is said that he is quite the anomaly because he didn't have any kind of condition that caused him to grow so tall. He just was, and because of the fact that at birth he was so small, doctors weren't sure if he was going to survive. Agnes might not be the tallest man on this list, but he sure wasn't small. He measured at 7'9", but he was also just a massive person with great strength, said to weigh 500 pounds and had the ability to lift a ship's anchor. It is said that Agnes would often receive requests from people who wanted to wrestle him, which is absolutely hilarious, but that one man changed his mind after he shook hands with Agnes, and Agnes continued to shake his hand until it bled. A little dramatic for sure, but I appreciate the effect. In 1849, Agnes joined the circus and would tour many countries before going into real estate and opening a store. In 1863, Agnes passed away as a result of brain fever. In our number 5 spot today, we have Robert Wadlow. Robert was born on February 22nd, 1918, and although he was an average size at birth, by age 5 he was already 5'4". Like, that's almost my height. Imagine an actual toddler walking around the size of a grown-ass man. New definition to the terrible twos. That's just kind of horrifying. Try to put him in a timeout, but you have to like square up. By 17 years old, he was standing at 8'1", making him one of the, if not the, tallest teenager ever. His huge appetite had him consuming 8,000 calories a day, but being this tall isn't all glitz and glamour, and it can come with some very serious side effects. He had trouble walking because of his fast growth, and this required him to have braces on his legs as well as use a walking stick. Unfortunately, an ill-fitted brace would eventually lead to his untimely death. In 1940, Robert received a new leg brace that didn't fit properly, and just 1 week later this brace caused a blister. Seems like a minor inconvenience, but this blister went on to become really infected. This infection very sadly went on to take Robert's life at the early age of just 22 years old. In our number 4 spot today, we have Anna Haining Bates. Anna was born in Nova Scotia in August 1846, and by the time she was 22 years old, she was already standing at a height of 7'6". At age 16, Anna went into show business because it was very clear she was taller than the average female. She began touring around, and in 1865 had a frightening moment at Barnum's Museum when it caught fire and she was too tall to escape through a window. She thought she had met her end because the stairs were on fire, but thankfully she was saved when employees broke the wall and she was lifted out with a crane. In 1871, Anna met another super tall person named Martin Van Buren Bates, who was also known as the Kentucky Giant and who was 7'8". The pair got married and were often exhibited at circuses as the tallest married couple in the world. Anna ended up passing away in 1888 at the age of 41. In our number 3 spot today, we have Joseph Edward Beaupre. Joseph is a man who was actually born in my home province of Saskatchewan in 1881, so imagine my shock when I realized that I had never even heard of him before. Joseph's parents were average height, so of course they were shocked when, by age 9, their son had already outgrown them. At the age of 17, he stood at 7'1" and is said to have been able to lift an 800-pound horse. By the time 1904 rolled around, Joseph was 8'3", and he tried to become a cowboy, but realized this probably wasn't the career for him, considering his feet touched the ground while he was riding a horse. At 21, he joined the circus, but as one can imagine, this took quite a toll on him, and it is said that he was also dealing with tuberculosis at the time, which is just crazy. Sadly, the story takes quite a dark turn as, at age 23, after a performance and after coughing up blood, Joseph went unconscious and never woke up again. The circus refused to pay his burial expenses, and his father was unfortunately too poor to afford it, which meant that his body remained with the undertakers, who began displaying it in store windows and museums. Joseph's body would remain with people who never should have had it in the first place until 1989, over 80 years after his death, when it was finally released to his surviving family members, who then cremated it. In our number 2 spot today, we have Patrick Cotter O'Brien. Patrick was born in Ireland in January of 1760, and he grew to be 8'1", which made him one of the first people to be known to grow past 8 feet tall. At 18 years old, he began working as a bricklayer because he didn't need a ladder to reach the top of the cottages like the rest of those he worked with. Like many people on this list, Patrick found himself in a life of show business where he just called himself O'Brien. It is said that he had to travel around in a carriage that was made specifically perfectly for him because of his size, and one day when this carriage was pulled over by a highwayman, when this guy saw Patrick, he ran the other way because he was terrified of his large stature. Sadly, Patrick's size took quite a toll on his body and eventually led to his death, which occurred on September 8th, 1806, when Patrick was 46 years old. In our number 1 spot today we have Arthur Cayley. Arthur was born in Sulby, Isle of Man in 1824, and while for the beginning of his life he was average size, in his late teens he suddenly began to grow quite tall, reaching a height of 7'11" and earning the nickname Manx Giant. Arthur was on display at many exhibits because of his height, and he traveled to places like Manchester, London, and Paris, but suddenly he disappeared. His mother explained that he had passed away and that he was already buried, but people were suspicious because it is said that just a few weeks earlier, his life was insured for $2,000. We still see it today, people committing insurance fraud, so it's not really that far-fetched of an idea, and here's what really happened. Arthur was not dead. He instead had traveled to the United States to join P.T. Barnum's circus. During his time in the circus, he was marketed as Colonel Routh Goshen, the Arabian Giant. It wasn't until his true death in 1889 that his previous life as the Manx Giant was revealed and the whole story was complete.
Number 10. Amazon Tools. The Amazon rainforest is home to many unique and dangerous creatures, as well as unsolved mysteries and lost civilizations. But did you know that the Amazon was actually once home to giants? At least this evidence discovered in 2012 seems to point to that being the truth. A group of Ecuadorian researchers ventured into the thick forest in order to follow ancient legends of a city of giants, and they actually found it. They found massive stone structures and even a large pyramid, the stones being so precisely cut and arranged that it could not have been just formed by the forces of nature. Within these structures, they also found massive stone tools that were too large for any normal-sized human to use, including hammers and chisels and other building tools. While some people do still chalk it up to natural formations, the team and many others stand by their belief that this city was once home to a race of giants.
In our number 9 spot today we have Bernard Coyne, also referred to as Bernard the Giant. He was born in Iowa on July 27th, 1897. His true height is still disputed. Some people say he was 8'2", some say he was 8'4", and some say he was as tall as 8'8", and whichever it really was, Bernard was clearly over 8 feet tall, which, especially in the 1800s, was unbelievable. Bernard's height can be attributed to a rare syndrome called unicoidal infantile gigantism, colloquially known as daddy long leg syndrome. Apparently, Bernard's parents for a while would exhibit their son in order to earn money. They'd put him on display, but eventually they stopped because they feared it might put them in the spotlight of God's wrath. I mean, yeah, no worries, don't worry about the effect it would have on your kid, just worry about the wrath of God. As Bernard got older, of course, people wanted to recruit him for the same sort of thing. They wanted him to put himself on display in exchange for money, but he would turn down these offers because he just wanted to live a normal life. Bernard was so tall that during World War I, he was actually rejected by the army due to his tall stature. Like many of the people on this list, Bernard would pass at quite a young age. In just 1921, Bernard died at the age of 23.
Number 8. Bigfoot. The first discovery of Sasquatch or Bigfoot footprints goes all the way back to the year 1811. Since then, there have been countless reports of Bigfoot sightings and encounters, and with the invention of photo and video cameras came massive amounts of apparent real footage of Bigfoot. Bigfoot is most often described as being a giant humanoid creature around 15 feet tall who tends to hang out in the woods and ignore fabricated mating calls from Bigfoot hunters on their television shows. These sightings also span all the way across the entire world, each country and culture having their own representation and name for the mysterious creature. From the Russian Yeti to the Australian Yowie, they're apparently everywhere. So while many photos and recordings of Bigfoot have been debunked, there are many people who truly believe the Bigfoot is real, and who's to say they couldn't potentially be a long-lost race of giants who had to move into the woods as society evolved. Number 7. West Virginia giants. The giant skeletons discovered in France aren't the only reports of giant remains being found. They have also been found in American soil, specifically in West Virginia. In 1774, a man named Jack Parsons was walking along a flooded river when he saw a bone sticking out of the ground. And like any normal person would do, he pulled it out, discovering it was a femur, but it was almost twice the size of his own. Alongside it, he found more bones and discovered a skeleton that was around 8 feet tall. In 1838, excavators found even more remains that were also much taller than the average person. In the 1850s, even more were found, though they soon went missing and were thought to have been stolen and sold. Over the years, even more remains were found in the late 1800s, one skeleton even being over 10 feet tall. The Giant Town and other places across West Virginia have even more stories of discoveries of this race of giants. Number 6. Robert Wadlow. Arguably the most famous real giant who you've probably heard of before is a man who was named Robert Wadlow. If you have read the Guinness Book of World Records or visited one of their walkthrough museums, you've probably seen his picture or stood next to his giant life-size statue. And yes, this guy was actually real and he was actually that tall. He was just brushing 9 feet tall at the time of his death in the summer of 1940. He was born in 1918 and at the time no one knew just how tall he was going to be, as he was an average sized baby weighing 8.7 pounds, which is less than I weighed when I was born, but to be fair, I was a big baby. He then quickly started to shoot up, and by the time he was 8 years old, he was almost 6 feet tall. For reference, the average 8-year-old is usually around 4 feet tall. He became a celebrity for his height, starring in the circus and doing a promotional tour for a shoe company. Unfortunately, his gigantism led to numerous medical issues and he died at the age of only 22. Number 5. Greek mythology. Now let's turn around and take a look back at some more theoretical proof of giants. Some famous giants from different cultures and legends. I know you may not think of this as real evidence, but I just love digging into these myths and depictions, and if so many different cultures across the world are writing about giants, this could be evidence that they're real, right? So let's start with the Greeks. Atlas was the name of a titan that went to war against Olympus. As we know, the Titans lost and Atlas was cursed to hold up the sky for the rest of eternity. Atlas also had a run-in with Perseus, who was a slayer of monsters. Atlas tried to scare Perseus away, and in response, Perseus took Medusa's head out of his bag and turned Atlas to stone, creating the range that is now known as the Atlas Mountains. But hey, at least he doesn't have to hold up the sky anymore. Number 4. Irish giants. Irish mythology believes that a race of giants known as the Fomorians were actually the original settlers of Ireland. Balor was the king of these one-eyed giants and was also the god of death. It was said that anyone who looked at him would die instantly. Because of this, he constantly kept his eye closed until it was absolutely necessary. A prophecy said that he would be killed by his own grandson, so he locked his daughter away to prevent her from having any children. But this didn't work, as a minor god snuck in and got comfortable with his daughter, and they loved each other very much, and she had 3 kids. But Balor was still thinking with his head, and so he threw all 3 kids into the ocean. Problem solved, right? Wrong. One of the sons survived and was raised by the god of the sea. The kid grew up, led a bunch of Irish gods into battle, and he killed Balor by ripping out his eye. Goodbye, King of Giants, you really tried your best. Number 3. The Bible. When you think of giants in the Bible, you may think of the story of Goliath, a giant who was defeated by a regular-sized shepherd named David. Goliath was a champion from the city of Gath, which is a place where a race of giants apparently originated from. His exact size is up in the air, but many people believe he was around 9'7" and wore a large amount of bronze armor. And here's how the story goes. David goes out to face Goliath, holding the fate of his people in his hands. So of course he's armed with a very menacing weapon, a slingshot. David uses his trusty slingshot to fire a rock, which hits Goliath right between his eyes, and Goliath falls down and dies immediately. Pretty good shot. David and Goliath has become an infamous story for representing the underdog, though my personal favorite story about underdogs is the movie Underdog, released in 2007. Number 2. GOGMAGOG. If you know me, then you know I'm constantly looking for names to name my future children, and this one is definitely a strong contender. GOGMAGOG is the name of the last British giant. A Welshman wrote a book about how early Britain was inhabited by a race of giants. One of them them being GOGMAGOG, 12 feet tall and able to easily uproot an oak tree. One day the giants attacked Brutus, descendant of the Trojans, and all the giants were killed except for good old Goggy. Brutus took GOGMAGOG to his second in command, who was apparently super into giant wrestling. The two wrestled and GOGMAGOG was going pretty ham and crushed a few of the guy's ribs, but this didn't kill the guy and instead just made him super angry. Fueled by his rage, the man was able to pick up GOGMAGOG, carry him up a hill, toss him off a cliff to his death, ridding the world of Britain's last giant. Rest in peace, GOGMAGOG. Number 1. HRUNGNIR. Giants exist all over Norse mythology, but the one that is known as the biggest and baddest is called HRUNGNIR. One day, Odin, the leader of the Norse gods of Asgard, challenged the giant to a horse race, which turns out to be a little unfair when you take into account the fact that Odin was riding his magical six-legged horse and HRUNGNIR just had a normal horse. He of course lost, and Odin at least felt a little bad about it, so he invited the giant back to Asgard for a drink. Like me, he couldn't handle his alcohol and started getting a little rowdy, saying that he would kill all of the gods of Asgard except for 2 goddesses, which he would bring back with him to the realm of the giants. The Asgardians were like, hey bro, that's kinda not cool, and told Thor to come deal with this clown. So the two met for battle, HRUNGNIR wearing stone armor and with a massive stone as his weapon. Thor picked up his magical hammer Mjolnir and it broke through both the stone and HRUNGNIR's face, killing him. I'm noticing a pattern in these stories that the giant always ends up dying, and probably why they're not around today.